Faith. My voice caught in my throat as she walked into the living room. It wasn't the time, exactly, that threw me off. She'd said she'd be back late from her pottery class, and it was pushing 10 now. No, it was everything else. She paused just inside the doorway, a kind of frozen stillness that wasn't like her at all. Normally, Faith burst through the door, a whirlwind of energy and stories about misshapen clay and kiln mishaps. Tonight, she was muted, like someone had turned the volume down on her entire being. I was on the sofa, flipping through channels, pretending to watch TV but really just waiting for her, the silence in the apartment stretching out like a rubber band about to snap. I lowered the remote, the muted sound of some late-night show fading into the background. "Hey," she finally said, her voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. She didn't meet my eyes, and that was the first prickle of unease. Faith always met my eyes. It was one of the things I loved about her. That direct, unwavering gaze that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. But tonight? She was looking anywhere but at me. Her gaze flickered around the room, landing on the lamp, the bookshelf, even the blank wall behind me, before finally settling on her own hands, which she was twisting together in front of her. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, casual. Like I hadn't noticed the shift, the subtle but undeniable change in her. But my heart had already started that familiar, anxious drumming against my ribs. She offered a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, fine. Just tired. Long class tonight. Tired. Okay, maybe." But even tired Faith was usually brighter. And it wasn't just her demeanor. It was her clothes. She was wearing a dress. Not just any dress, but that slinky black number she usually reserved for special occasions, for dinners out, for dates. Pottery class was messy business. You wore old jeans, maybe an apron smeared with clay. Not a dress that looked like it belonged in a dimly lit restaurant, not a studio covered in glaze. My eyes scanned her quickly, trying to make sense of it. The dress, the way her hair was styled, looser, somehow, softer around her face than when she usually scraped it back for class. And was that makeup? Just a hint, maybe, a subtle darkening around her eyes, a touch of something on her lips. Faith rarely wore makeup during the week, especially not for pottery. "You're wearing a dress," I said, the words sounding awkward, even to my own ears. She glanced down at herself, as if just realizing what she had on. "Oh, this old thing. Yeah, well, Heather. You know Heather from class?" She was going out after for a drink, to celebrate finishing her teapot. And she she insisted I come. Just for one spontaneous thing. I didn't have time to change. Her explanation tumbled out, too fast, too rehearsed. Heather from pottery class. I'd met Heather once, a quiet woman, nice enough. But Heather going out for spontaneous celebratory drinks in a dressy black number? And Faith, usually so meticulous, so practical, suddenly swept up in this unplanned, glamorous post-pottery outing? It felt wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. A cold dread started to creep up my spine. This wasn't just tiredness. This wasn't just a spontaneous drink with Heather. This was something else. Something colder, harder, and infinitely more unsettling. And the way she wouldn't look me in the eye. It screamed louder than any accusation. Something was definitely, terrifyingly, off. "Heather, huh?" I repeated, the name feeling foreign and brittle on my tongue. I watched her carefully, trying to gauge her reaction, searching for any flicker of, what? Guilt. Deception. But her face remained carefully neutral, a practiced mask I suddenly realized I'd never seen before. "Yeah, Heather," she said again, a little firmer this time, as if trying to convince herself as much as me. She finally moved further into the room, heading towards the kitchen, her movements still strangely subdued. As she walked, the fabric of that black dress shifted, clinging to her body in a way that made me notice something else. something that sent another jolt of ice water through my veins. Everything looked like there was no underwear. Under that slinky dress, there was just skin. Faith never went out without underwear. Never. It was a small thing, maybe, a detail most people wouldn't even register. But for me, knowing Faith's habits, her meticulous nature, it was like a flashing neon sign screaming, "Something is wrong. Terribly wrong." My mind raced, trying to reconcile this new, unsettling detail with her flimsy explanation about Heather and spontaneous drinks. It wasn't adding up. None of it. The dress, the makeup, the hair, the muted demeanor, the averted eyes, and now, this. She was at the kitchen counter now, her back to me, busying herself with something. Getting a glass of water, maybe, or just pretending to. I stayed put on the sofa, pretending to still be interested in the muted TV, but my senses were hyper-focused on her, dissecting every movement, every sound. My heart was hammering against my ribs now, a frantic drumbeat of anxiety and growing dread. I needed to say something, ask something, confront her with the swirling vortex of questions that were building inside me. But the words caught in my throat, paralyzed by a strange mix of fear and disbelief. Fear of what she might say, fear of what I might hear. Disbelief that this was actually happening, that Faith, my Faith, could be standing there, just a few feet away, radiating this palpable aura of deception. She turned back around, glass of water in hand, and finally, reluctantly, met my eyes. Her gaze was still guarded, hesitant, but there was something else there now, too. A flicker of defiance? Or maybe just resignation. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer than ever, almost a whisper. "Yeah, fine," I managed to croak out, the lie feeling thick and heavy in the air between us. You surprised me coming home in a dress." It was weak, pathetic, but it was the best I could do in that moment. She took a sip of water, her eyes still fixed on mine, unblinking. "Like I said, Heather's idea. Spontaneous. Spontaneous." The word echoed in my head, hollow and unconvincing. I wanted to push, to press her, to demand the truth, whatever it was. But something held me back. A primal instinct, maybe, a sense that if I pushed too hard, too fast, whatever fragile facade she was presenting would shatter, and I might not be ready for what lay beneath. "Right," I said again, forcing a small, tight smile. "Spontaneous." The rest of the evening passed in a strained, suffocating silence. We went through the motions of our usual routine. Faith changed into her pajamas, we brushed our teeth side by side in the bathroom, got into bed. But the comfortable intimacy that usually filled our evenings was gone, replaced by a vast, unbridgeable chasm of unspoken questions and mounting suspicion. Lying in the dark next to her, listening to her even breathing, my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the image of her in that dress, the absence of a panty line, the carefully constructed story about Heather. It was a puzzle, a terrifying, heartbreaking puzzle, and I desperately needed to find the missing pieces. Sleep was impossible. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Faith. My heart hammered in my chest as I walked into the living room, drawn by an almost magnetic pull towards. What? I wasn't even sure. Then I saw it. On the coffee table, next to her purse, lay her phone. Face down. Faith never left her phone lying around. She was meticulous about charging it, keeping it in her bag, always within reach. Leaving it out in the open like this was unusual. My breath hitched in my throat. It was a stupid idea, reckless, a complete invasion of privacy. But I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached out, hovering over the phone, trembling slightly. This was wrong, I knew it was wrong. But the need to know, to understand, to find some kind of answer, was overwhelming. I picked it up, my fingers fumbling with the power button. The screen flickered to life. No lock screen. Another anomaly. Faith always had a passcode. Why was it off now? My thumb hovered over the screen, my eyes scanning the notifications. Mostly routine stuff. news alerts, social media updates. Then, at the very top, a message notification. From unknown number. My finger tapped it, my heart pounding in my ears. The message app opened. The conversation was brief, just a few exchanges. And then I saw it. A message sent just an hour ago. From this unknown number. Just got home. Still buzzing from tonight. That dress. You were incredible. Can't wait to see you again. The words swam before my eyes, blurring with unshed tears. The blood drained from my face, leaving me cold and numb. The room seemed to spin. My hand went slack, and Faith's phone slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the coffee table. The sound seemed deafening in the silence of the apartment. I stared at the phone, at the glowing screen, at those devastating words. The truth, cold and sharp as broken glass, pierced through me. It wasn't Heather. It wasn't spontaneous drinks. It was him. Whoever he was. A wave of nausea washed over me, followed by a crushing weight of despair. Betrayal. The word echoed in my mind, a heavy, sickening thud. My wife. Faith. Cheating on me. I stood there for a long moment, paralyzed, reeling from the shock. Then, slowly, a different emotion began to surface. Not anger, not yet, but a chilling sense of determination. I wouldn't confront her. Not yet. Not until I knew everything. I needed to know who this was, how long it had been going on, everything. I would watch, I would listen, I would gather every piece of evidence, every clue. And then, only then, would I confront her. I picked up her phone again, carefully deleting the message notification, erasing any trace of my intrusion. Then, I placed it back exactly where I found it, face down on the coffee table. I walked back to the bedroom, slipped back into bed beside Faith, and lay there in the darkness, my eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling. The dread was still there, heavy and suffocating. But beneath it, a new resolve was hardening within me. The game had changed, and I was ready to play. But I would play it my way. Silently. Calculatedly. For now, Faith would never know that I knew. And that, I realized with a grim satisfaction, would be my first advantage. The alarm blared at 6:30 a.m., shattering the fragile pretense of normalcy we'd somehow maintained through the rest of the night. I reached over and slammed it silent, the sudden quiet amplifying the frantic thumping in my chest. Beside me, Faith stirred, her breathing still deep and even. Unaware. Or pretending to be. The thought twisted in my gut like a cold fist. I watched her for a moment, the curve of her cheek in the soft morning light, the gentle rise and fall of her chest. This woman, the woman I had shared my life with, my bed with, my dreams with, was a stranger. Or had she always been? The question gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. We went through the morning routine in silence, a strained ballet of familiar movements devoid of any warmth or connection. Coffee was brewed, toast popped, teeth brushed, each action mechanical, hollow. Faith hummed softly to herself as she got ready for work, a cheerful little tune that grated on my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. How could she hum? How could she act like everything was normal when I was burning up inside with this secret knowledge? I watched her put on her makeup, the same careful, precise movements she always used. Today, though, it felt different. Calculated. Like she was preparing for another performance, another role in this twisted play she was starring in. My gaze lingered on her lips as she applied lipstick, remembering the message on her phone. That dress. You were incredible. Who had kissed those lips last night? Who had seen her, incredible, in that dress? The question hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating, even though neither of us spoke it aloud. The silence screamed louder than any accusation could have. The day crawled by, each hour a slow, agonizing stretch. I went through the motions at work, meetings, emails, phone calls. But my mind was miles away, replaying last night, dissecting every detail, searching for answers, for explanations, for some way to make sense of the senseless. I found myself constantly checking my phone, half expecting, half dreading a message from Faith, a confession, a denial, anything. But nothing came. Silence. A thick, impenetrable wall of silence. By the time Faith got home, I was coiled tight, ready to snap. I'd spent the day alternating between white-hot rage and a hollow, aching despair. The resolve I'd felt last night, the cool calculation, was fraying at the edges, threatened by the raw, churning emotions that were clawing their way to the surface. She walked in, her usual breezy "hey" echoing in the apartment. But it sounded forced, brittle, lacking its usual warmth. She avoided my eyes, heading straight for the kitchen, just like last night. History repeating itself. This time, I couldn't hold it in. The pressure had built up too much, the silence stretched too tight. It had to break. "Faith, we need to talk," I said, my voice sounding rough, strained. I stayed seated on the sofa, watching her, my gaze unwavering, demanding. She paused by the kitchen counter, her back to me, just like the night before. Déjà vu. A sick, twisted sense of it. "Talk about what?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral, too casual. "About last night," I said, the words hanging in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She turned around slowly, finally meeting my gaze. Her eyes were guarded, wary, but still, defiant. "Last night? What about last night?" She played dumb, the act almost insulting in its blatant obviousness. "The pottery class," I said, keeping my voice deliberately level, controlled. "The spontaneous drinks with Heather." A flicker of something crossed her face then, too fast to decipher. Surprise. Annoyance. Guilt. It was gone before I could grasp it, replaced by that carefully constructed mask again. "Yeah. What about it?" she repeated, her voice a little sharper this time. "The dress, Faith," I pressed, my voice still quiet but laced with steel. "The black dress you wore to pottery class. The one you said was for spontaneous drinks with Heather." She shrugged, a dismissive gesture that sent a fresh wave of anger surging through me. "So, what's wrong with a dress? Pottery class. Faith. You wear jeans to pottery class. Old clothes. Not a slinky black dress." And I paused, letting the next detail hang in the air, heavy with implication. No underwear. Her eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second, betraying her carefully constructed composure. Then, she recovered, her expression hardening. "What are you talking about? You're being ridiculous, Simon." She tried to laugh it off, a strained, unnatural sound. "You're analyzing my clothes now? Seriously?" "Don't," I said, my voice low, dangerous. "Don't insult my intelligence, Faith. I'm not stupid." She shifted her weight, her gaze flickering away again, darting around the room, anywhere but at me. "I told you, Heather invited me for a drink after class. It was spontaneous. I didn't have time to change." The same flimsy, rehearsed excuse. "And the makeup. And the hair. Did Heather spontaneously do your hair and makeup too?" My voice was rising now, the control slipping. The anger was bubbling over, hot and corrosive. She crossed her arms defensively, her lips tightening into a thin line. "Look, I don't know what your problem is. I went to pottery class, then I went for a drink with a friend. End of story. Why are you making such a big deal out of it?" "Because it's a lie, Faith." I finally exploded, the words ripping out of me, raw and unfiltered. I stood up, the sudden movement startling her. "It's all a lie. The dress, the drinks, Heather, everything. It's bullshit, Faith, and you know it." She flinched, taking a step back, her eyes finally showing a flicker of fear. "Don't yell at me, Simon. Don't lie to me." I roared back, my voice echoing in the suddenly charged silence. "I know, Faith. I know about him." The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and ashen. Her carefully constructed mask finally cracked, shattered into a million pieces. For a moment, she just stared at me, speechless, her eyes wide with shock and something else. Panic. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lowered her gaze, avoiding my eyes again. And in that gesture, in that averted gaze, I saw the truth reflected, clear and undeniable. She wasn't going to deny it anymore. The game was up. How do you know?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't matter how I know," I said, my voice still shaking with anger but regaining a cold, hard edge. "What matters is that I do. And that you lied to me. To my face. Again and again." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. She still wouldn't look at me, her gaze fixed on the floor. Then finally, she spoke, her voice low, almost defiant. "Yes," she said, the word hanging in the air like a confession, a challenge, a surrender. "Yes, there is someone else." The admission hit me like a physical blow, even though I already knew, had already seen the proof with my own eyes. Hearing her say it, confirming my worst fears, was like a fresh wound being ripped open. Pain, raw and agonizing, flooded through me, stealing my breath, squeezing my chest. "Who?" I managed to choke out, the word barely a whisper. She shrugged again, that same dismissive gesture that infuriated me. "Does it matter? Does it matter?" My voice rose again, laced with disbelief and a burning, bitter anger. "Does it matter? You're telling me you're cheating on me, and you're asking me if it matters." "It just happened," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It wasn't planned." "Oh, it just happened," I repeated, the words dripping with sarcasm. "Like you accidentally fell into bed with him? In your black dress, with no underwear, after pottery class." She finally looked up at me then, her eyes hard, cold. And in them, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Not guilt. Not remorse. But resentment. As if I was the one who had done something wrong. "Maybe you weren't giving me what I needed," she said, her voice laced with a cold accusation. The words hit me harder than any blow could have. "What you needed?" I repeated, stunned, reeling from the sheer audacity of it. You think this is my fault? That you cheating on me is my fault?" "Maybe," she said again, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe if you were more attentive, more exciting." The anger that had been simmering inside me finally erupted, a volcanic explosion of rage, pain, and utter, soul-crushing betrayal. Years of love, of trust, of shared life, dissolving, evaporating into thin air. Shattered. Gone. Because I wasn't exciting enough? "Get out," I said, my voice trembling with fury, each word clipped, sharp, lethal. She blinked, as if surprised by the vehemence in my voice. "What? Get out!" I roared, my control finally snapping completely. "Get out of my house, Faith. Pack your things and leave. Now. I don't want to see you here anymore. Not for another second. Get out." Tears finally welled up in her eyes, but they looked more like tears of self-pity than remorse. "Simon, please," she started, her voice pleading now, but it was too late. The dam had broken. The trust was gone, irrevocably, irreparably destroyed. "Just go," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Before I say something I really regret. Just pack your things and get the hell out of my life." She stared at me for another long, silent moment, her face a mask of wounded indignation. Then, slowly, reluctantly, she turned and walked towards the bedroom, her shoulders slumped, her head down. Leaving me standing alone in the living room, trembling with rage and grief, the echo of my own words ringing in my ears. "Get out." And as I watched her go, a strange, hollow sense of finality settled over me. It was over. It was really, finally, over. And the silence that descended after she left for the bedroom was the sound of everything I had known, everything I had believed in, crumbling to dust. The bedroom door clicked shut with a soft, final sound, and the apartment fell silent. A different kind of silence now. Not the strained, suffocating silence of the past few days, but a hollow, echoing void. A silence that screamed of absence, of emptiness, of loss. I stood in the living room, rooted to the spot, listening to the silence, letting it wash over me, letting it seep into my bones. She was gone. Faith was actually gone. The realization hit me in waves, each one bringing a fresh surge of pain, a deeper ache of loss. Slowly, almost mechanically, I moved. Walked over to the window, stared out at the city lights blurring through the film of unshed tears in my eyes. The city hummed with life, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shattered my world. Life went on. But mine had just stopped. Or at least, everything I knew as life had ceased to exist. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, a hot, corrosive acid eating away at me. But beneath the anger, a vast ocean of sadness was rising, threatening to drown me in its depths. Sadness for what was lost, for what could have been, for the years we had shared, now tainted, poisoned by her betrayal. I turned away from the window, my gaze falling on the coffee table. Faith's phone was still there, face down, exactly where I had left it. A silent accusation. A concrete piece of evidence of her deceit. I resisted the urge to pick it up, to smash it, to hurl it against the wall. What was the point? It was just a thing. It couldn't hurt me any more than she already had. The apartment felt different. Empty. Cold. Even the air seemed thinner, harder to breathe. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of her, of us. The framed photos on the bookshelf, smiling, happy faces from vacations, holidays, anniversaries. Lies. All lies. Or at least, they felt like lies now. Could any of it have been real? Had she ever truly loved me? Or had it all been an elaborate performance, a carefully constructed charade that she had tired of, discarded when something more exciting came along? The thought was like a knife twist. Not exciting enough. Her words echoed in my head, cold and cruel. Was that it? Was I that boring? That inadequate? Self-doubt, a venomous weed, began to sprout in the fertile ground of my grief and anger. Had I failed her somehow? Had I driven her to this? Was there something I could have done differently? I sank onto the sofa, burying my face in my hands, trying to block out the images, the memories, the questions that were swirling in my mind like a chaotic storm. My chest ached, a physical manifestation of the emotional pain that was tearing me apart. I felt hollowed out, emptied, like a shell of my former self. Hours passed, blurring into a long, dark stretch of time. I didn't move, didn't eat, didn't drink. Just sat there in the silence, in the growing darkness, letting the pain wash over me, letting the grief consume me. The apartment became colder, darker, more oppressive. The silence grew heavier, more suffocating. It felt like the walls were closing in, crushing me with the weight of my loss and betrayal. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, dragging me down into a restless, dream-filled sleep on the sofa. Even in sleep, there was no escape. Her face haunted my dreams, her voice echoed in my ears, her betrayal replayed itself in endless, agonizing loops. I woke up to a gray, bleak morning, the apartment still shrouded in a heavy, oppressive silence. The light filtering through the window was weak, muted, doing little to dispel the gloom that had settled over everything. I felt stiff, achy, and utterly, soul-wearily exhausted. As if I hadn't slept at all. As if I had been fighting a battle all night, a losing battle against the demons of grief and betrayal. Dragging myself off the sofa, I walked into the kitchen, the same kitchen where we had shared countless breakfasts, countless mornings filled with laughter and easy conversation. Now it was just a kitchen. Cold, sterile, empty. The coffee maker sat on the counter, unused, silent. I couldn't even bring myself to make coffee. What was the point? Everything tasted like ash anyway. I wandered aimlessly through the apartment, touching things, picking things up, putting them down. Her things. Our things. Objects imbued with memories, now tainted, poisoned. A framed photo from our wedding day, Faith radiant in white, me beaming with happiness. A half-finished pottery project on the shelf in the living room, a lopsided vase she had been working on, frozen in time, unfinished, just like us. A book on the nightstand beside the bed, marked with a bookmark halfway through, a book she would never finish reading in this bed, beside me. Each object was a fresh stab of pain, a reminder of what was lost, of what was irrevocably broken. I felt like an archaeologist excavating the ruins of my own life, sifting through the debris of a shattered relationship, searching for what? Clues, explanations, or just some small piece of myself that hadn't been destroyed in the wreckage. Standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the ghosts of our life together, I felt a wave of despair wash over me, so intense it almost buckled my knees. I wanted to scream, to rage, to break things, to lash out at something, anything, to release the pent-up agony that was tearing me apart. But I was too exhausted, too numb, too drained to even summon the energy for anger. Instead, I just stood there, in the silence, in the emptiness, and let the tears finally come. Silent tears, hot and heavy, streaming down my face, blurring my vision, soaking into my shirt. Tears of grief, tears of anger, tears of self-pity, tears for everything that was, and everything that would never be. I cried until there were no more tears left, until my chest ached and my head throbbed, until I was completely emptied, wrung out and exhausted. And when the tears finally subsided, a strange kind of calm settled over me. Not peace, not happiness, not even relief, but a quiet acceptance. The pain was still there, a dull, persistent ache in my heart. The anger still flickered beneath the surface, a low, smoldering ember. The self-doubt still whispered insidious questions in my ear. But beneath all of that, something else was stirring. A tiny spark of resilience. I looked around the apartment again, at the emptiness, at the silence, at the ghosts of our past. It was painful, yes. But it wasn't unbearable. I was still standing. I was still breathing. I was still here. And in that moment, a faint glimmer of something began to emerge from the darkness. Not a clear path forward, not a sudden burst of optimism, but just a tiny, hesitant step towards survival. It would be long. It would be hard. The scars would be deep, and they would take a long time to heal. I knew that. But maybe, just maybe, I would heal. Maybe one day the pain would fade. Maybe one day, the silence wouldn't be so deafening. Maybe one day, I could look at these photos, at these objects, without feeling this crushing weight of loss and betrayal. Maybe. It was just a maybe, a fragile hope, a whisper in the darkness. But it was enough. For now, it was enough. It was a starting point. A tiny seed of hope planted in the barren wasteland of my broken heart. The anxiety, though, still lingered. A cold knot in my stomach, a tightening in my chest. The future stretched out before me, vast and uncertain, shrouded in mist. I didn't know what it held. I didn't know where to go from here. But I knew one thing. I would keep going, one step at a time. Through the pain, through the grief, through the uncertainty. I would survive this. I had to. For myself. For the man I used to be, and for the man I might become. The road ahead was long and dark, but somewhere, far in the distance, I hoped, there was a light. And I would keep walking towards it, one slow, painful step at a time. The first step was the hardest, but once it was taken, a strange sense of momentum began to build. The lawyer's office was intimidating, all polished wood and hushed whispers, but the act of signing the divorce papers felt surprisingly liberating. Like severing a final tie, cutting loose a dead weight that had been dragging me down. It wasn't joyful, not by any stretch. More like a grim, necessary surgery. Painful, but essential for survival. Leaving the office, clutching a copy of the filed documents, the gray morning seemed a little less bleak, the air a little less heavy. The world hadn't magically transformed into a sunlit paradise, but the oppressive weight on my chest had eased, just a fraction. A tiny crack of light in the darkness. I called Mark, my best friend since college. We hadn't talked much in the past few months. Not really talked. Just surface-level exchanges, polite inquiries, carefully avoided silences that screamed volumes about the unspoken chasm that had opened up in my life. "Hey man," Mark answered, his voice sounding genuinely surprised to hear from me. "Hey Mark," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, normal. "You busy later?" "Nah, not really." "Why? What's up?" There was a cautious note in his voice, a hesitancy that mirrored my own. We had both been walking on eggshells around each other, unsure how to navigate this new, fractured landscape of my life. Fancy grabbing a beer? Or hitting that old comic book shop we used to haunt? It was a long shot, a tentative reach back to a shared past, a simpler time before everything had gone to hell. There was a pause, just a beat too long, and then, "Yeah man. Yeah, that sounds great. Comic shop then beers." His voice was warmer now, the cautiousness receding, replaced by something like relief. "Comic shop then beers," I confirmed, a small, genuine smile finally tugging at the corners of my mouth. It was just a comic book shop, just a beer. But it was a start, a reconnection, a step back towards the world, towards life, towards myself. The comic book shop was exactly as I remembered it, a chaotic, wonderfully cluttered haven of nostalgia and escapism. The scent of old paper and ink hit me the moment I walked in, triggering a flood of memories. Afternoons spent poring over dog-eared pages, debating storylines, dreaming of superpowers. It felt good, familiar, comforting in its unchanging familiarity. Mark and I browsed in comfortable silence for a while, picking up old favorites, flipping through new releases, rediscovering forgotten gems. We talked about superheroes, about villains, about the intricate universes woven within the pages. Normal conversation. Easy banter. No mention of faith, no awkward silences. Just two old friends reconnecting over a shared love of something simple and pure. Later, in the dimly lit pub, nursing pints of cold beer, the conversation shifted, naturally, inevitably, towards the unspoken. "So," Mark started, swirling the foam in his glass, his gaze serious but gentle. "How are you, really?" I took a long swig of beer, the cold liquid a welcome balm to the tightness in my throat. "Divorce papers are filed," I said, stating it plainly, without drama. Mark nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine. "Big step." "Yeah," I said. "Feels final. And, weirdly, a little lighter." He smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "Good man. That's really good to hear." We talked then, really talked, for the first time in months. I told him about finding the message, about the confrontation, about the icy coldness in Faith's eyes when she told me it was my fault. I didn't hold back, didn't sugarcoat it, just let it all spill out, the anger, the pain, the confusion, the lingering self-doubt. Mark listened patiently, offering words of support, of understanding, of unwavering friendship. He didn't try to fix it, didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. Just listened. And that, more than anything, was what I needed. To be heard. To be seen. To be reminded that I wasn't alone in this. That evening with Mark was a turning point. A small one, maybe, but significant nonetheless. It was the first time since everything had fallen apart that I had felt a flicker of something other than despair and anger. A flicker of connection, of normalcy, of hope. In the days and weeks that followed, I started taking other small steps, tentative forays back into the world, back towards myself. I dusted off my old guitar, the one that had been gathering dust in the corner of the bedroom for years, and started strumming again, hesitant chords at first, then gradually, more confidently, rediscovering the music that had once been a central part of my life. I started going for runs again, pounding the pavement, pushing my body, letting the physical exertion clear my head and release some of the pent-up tension. And I started making changes to the apartment. Small things at first, rearranging the furniture, taking down some of the photos that felt too painful to look at, boxing up Faith's things that she hadn't yet collected, creating space, both physically and emotionally. Then, bolder changes. I repainted the living room, choosing a color that I actually liked, not the bland neutral beige that Faith had insisted on. I bought a new rug, something vibrant and patterned, something that reflected my own taste, my own personality. I even hung some of my old band posters back up on the walls, reclaiming the space, making it feel like mine again. Like me again. It was a slow process, a gradual transformation, both of the apartment and of myself. There were still days, many days, when the grief would hit me in waves, when the anger would flare up, when the self-doubt would whisper its insidious lies. But those days were becoming less frequent, less intense. The good days, the days when I felt a flicker of genuine hope, were starting to outnumber the bad ones. One evening, sitting in my newly repainted living room, strumming my guitar, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, it hit me. Not a sudden epiphany, not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet, dawning realization. It was over. The marriage was over. The pain was still there, a dull ache, but it wasn't crippling anymore. And in the space that her absence had created, something new was starting to grow. Me. The affair, Faith's betrayal, the end of my marriage. It had been the most painful, devastating experience of my life. But it had also been a catalyst. A brutal, unwelcome catalyst, but a catalyst nonetheless. It had shattered my world, yes, but in shattering it, it had also cleared the ground, making space for something new to be built. Something stronger, something more authentic, something mine. I looked around the living room, at the brightly colored rug, the vibrant walls, the familiar posters, the guitar in my hands. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't whole. There were still scars, visible and invisible. But it was me. It was my space, my life, my future. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Not happiness, not yet, but a quiet, grounded peace. And beneath it, a burgeoning sense of excitement. For what the future might hold. For the man I was becoming. For the new beginning that was unfolding, slowly, painfully, but surely, from the ashes of the old. The road ahead was still uncertain, still unknown. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to walk it. Alone. But not lonely. Just free. Free to be me. Free to build my own life. Free to start again. And in that freedom, in that possibility, lay a fragile but real hope.